The glass shattered before anyone understood why Elena Marsh had thrown it. The ballroom of the Grandview Hotel fell silent. 300 guests frozen mid-conversation, champagne glasses raised halfway to lips that would never finish the toast. Elena stood in the center of the marble floor, her cream engagement dress catching the light of 1,000 crystal beads above her, and her hands were shaking so hard that the shards at her feet seemed to tremble too. Julian Cole stood 10 feet away, his tuxedo jacket unbuttoned, his face pale as paper. Beside him, close enough that their shoulders had been touching only a moment before, stood Camille Hart, Elena's best friend since childhood, her maid of honor, the woman who was supposed to stand beside Elena at the altar in 6 weeks. Nobody in the room understood the full weight of what they were witnessing. To them, it looked like a woman having a breakdown at her own engagement party. They did not know that 10 minutes earlier, Elena had walked into the private lounge behind the ballroom to fetch her father's reading glasses, and had found Julian's hand resting on the small of Camille's back, and had heard him whisper words that no man says to his fiancé's best friend unless something has already been broken beyond repair. Elena had not screamed then. She had stood frozen in the doorway, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes were showing her, until Camille had looked up and gone white, and Julian had turned, and the three of them had stood in a triangle of silence that felt longer than the 6 years Elena and Julian had been together. Now, back in the ballroom, in front of everyone who mattered, Elena finally let the truth arrive. "Say it," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. "Say what you were doing in that room, Julian. Say it in front of everyone, the way you were happy to do it in private." Julian opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Camille stepped forward instead, her hands raised as though trying to calm a frightened animal. "Elena, please. You're misunderstanding something so small. We were only talking. You know how close we've always been. Don't do this in front of your family. Don't embarrass yourself." "Embarrass myself?" Elena laughed, and the sound was sharp and strange even to her own ears. "You were his mistake, and somehow I'm the one who should be embarrassed." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Elena's mother, Diane, pushed forward from near the head table, her face a mask of confusion and dawning horror. Elena's father, Richard Marsh, a respected but quiet businessman, stood frozen with his glass still in his hand, as though moving might make the scene in front of him more real than he could bear. It was Julian who finally spoke, and when he did, his words were worse than silence. "Elena, you're overreacting." Nothing happened. Camille was upset about something. I was comforting her. That's all this was. You saw two friends talking, and you built a story in your head. The lie was so smooth, so practiced, that for one terrible second Elena almost believed she had imagined the whole thing. That was the worst part of loving someone who could lie so well. He had always been good at making the truth sound unreasonable, and his excuses sound like reason itself. But she had heard what she heard. She had seen what she saw. And something in her, some quiet strength she did not know she possessed until this exact moment, refused to let him rewrite the last 10 minutes of her life. "You called her the same name you call me," Elena said quietly, and this time her voice did not shake. "You said the exact words you said to me on the night you proposed. Do you think I would forget those words, Julian? Do you think a woman forgets the night a man asks her to spend her whole life with him?" Julian's face went from pale to ash gray. Around the room, guests who had been whispering now stood in stunned quiet, watching the truth do what lies could never survive. Camille tried one more time. "Elena, please. We can talk about this somewhere private, not here, not like this." "You don't get to decide where I fall apart," Elena said. "You took that choice from me the moment you decided my fiancé was worth more to you than our friendship." She looked around the room then, at the faces of people who had known her since she was a little girl, people who had come tonight to celebrate what they believed was the beginning of her happiest chapter. She saw pity in some eyes, confusion in others, and in a few faces near the back, something crueler, something that looked almost like enjoyment, as though her pain was simply the evening's entertainment. It was in that moment, standing in the wreckage of her own celebration, that Elena noticed a man she did not recognize. He was seated near the far side of the room, at a table reserved for her father's business associates, and unlike everyone else, he was not staring at her with pity or curiosity. He was watching her the way one might watch someone standing at the edge of a storm and refusing to be blown away by it. There was something steady in his gaze, something that did not waver even as the whispers around him grew louder. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit that fit him with the kind of precision that only comes from tailoring, not from off-the-rack purchase. His hair was neatly combed, his jaw set in quiet composure, and though Elena had never met him before tonight, there was an unmistakable air of authority around him, the kind that came not from wealth alone, but from a lifetime of being listened to. She did not know yet that his name was Nathaniel Ashbourne, that he held the title of Duke, that he had flown in that very afternoon as a guest of her father's oldest business partner. She did not know that in less than an hour, this stranger would step into the center of her shattered evening and change the entire direction of her life. For now, she only knew that someone in this room of judgment and gossip was looking at her not as a woman who had failed to keep her fiancé faithful, but as a woman who had just survived something terrible with more grace than anyone had the right to expect. Elena turned back to Julian and Camille, her chest rising and falling with the effort of holding herself together. "I want both of you to leave," she said. "Not just this party. My life." "Elena, you're being dramatic," Julian said, and something in his tone had shifted from apology to irritation, as though her hurt was becoming inconvenient to him. "We can fix this quietly. There's no need to turn this into a scene in front of your father's clients." And there it was again, the same instinct he had shown 100 times before, the instinct to protect his image before he protected her heart. "You didn't think about my father's clients when you had your hand on her back," Elena said. "You only think about appearances now that the truth is inconvenient for you." Diane Marsh finally reached her daughter's side, wrapping an arm around Elena's shoulders, though her eyes were fixed on Julian with a fury that made even the stoic Richard Marsh take a step back. "I think you should leave," Diane said to Julian, her voice low and dangerous. "Both of you. Now." For a moment, it seemed as though Julian might argue further, might try once more to twist the narrative back into his favor, but the weight of every eye in the room finally seemed to land on him at once, and he seemed to shrink under it. He turned, grabbed Camille's wrist, and began walking toward the exit, though even in retreat, he could not resist one final attempt at control. "This isn't over, Elena," he said over his shoulder. "You'll regret how you're handling this." "The only thing I regret," Elena said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "is not seeing you clearly until tonight." The doors closed behind them, and the ballroom exhaled as one, the tension breaking into 100 separate conversations, all of them about her, all of them about what had just happened, all of them things she would have to face in the weeks to come. But for this one moment, standing in the wreckage of broken glass and broken promises, Elena allowed herself to feel something other than heartbreak. She felt relief. She did not yet know that the stranger watching her from across the room had already decided, in the span of those 10 minutes, that he would not let this evening end with her standing alone. The party did not end when Julian and Camille walked out the door. If anything, it grew louder, though the laughter had changed shape, turned into something sharper, something that fed on the scandal instead of the celebration it was meant to be. Elena stood near the head table while her mother fussed over her, straightening a strand of hair that had fallen loose, whispering reassurances that neither of them believed. Around them, small clusters of guests leaned toward each other, voices dropping to whispers the moment Elena glanced their way, then rising again once she looked elsewhere. She recognized the pattern. She had seen it happen to other people at other parties, had even participated in it herself once or twice, without thinking much of the cruelty involved. Now she understood exactly how it felt to be the subject of 100 private conversations happening in a single public room. "Do you want to go home?" her mother asked gently. Elena considered the question for a long moment. Going home meant admitting defeat, meant letting Julian's betrayal chase her out of a room she had every right to stand in. She thought of her grandmother, a woman who had survived far worse than a broken engagement, who used to say that leaving a room in shame only taught the room that shame was the correct response. "No," Elena said. "I want to stay. I want them to see that I'm still standing." Her father, usually a man of few words, placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "That's my girl," he said quietly. "Let them talk. Talking never broke anyone who refused to break." Not everyone in the room shared her father's kindness. Near the bar, Elena caught sight of 2 women she had known since university, their heads tilted together, eyes flicking toward her with poorly disguised amusement. One of them, a woman named Priscilla, had never particularly liked Elena, and tonight her expression carried the unmistakable satisfaction of someone watching a rival stumble. "I heard she caught them in the coat room," Priscilla said to her companion, not quite quietly enough, practically on top of each other. "No wonder he strayed," the other woman replied. "She's always been a bit much, hasn't she? All that ambition, all that career talk. Some men want a partner who's softer." Elena felt the words land like small stones, each one aimed with precision at the doubts she had never quite managed to silence. She had built a career in event coordination through relentless work, had turned down easier paths more than once because she wanted to earn her success rather than borrow it, and there had always been voices, quiet but persistent, suggesting that her ambition made her somehow less lovable, less deserving of a partner's loyalty. She refused to let those voices win tonight. Across the room, near the tall windows overlooking the city lights, the man in the dark suit remained where he had been sitting, though Elena noticed he was no longer speaking with the associates at his table. His attention had shifted entirely toward the small dramas unfolding around the room, and more than once, Elena caught him watching the whispering clusters with an expression of quiet, controlled disapproval, as though he found something distasteful in watching a woman be picked apart for surviving a betrayal that was never her fault. She did not approach him. She had no reason to, not yet, and her mind was far too occupied with the practical business of holding herself together to spare much thought for a stranger's opinion of the room's cruelty. Meanwhile, outside in the hotel's private parking area, Julian and Camille sat in his car, in tense silence, the engine running, though neither of them had suggested driving anywhere. "We need a plan," Julian said finally, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened. "By tomorrow, half the city will have heard some version of this. We need to get ahead of it before Elena's version becomes the only one anyone remembers." Camille stared out the window, her arms wrapped around herself, as though trying to hold in something that threatened to spill out. "There's no version of this that makes us look good, Julian. We were caught. There's no story we can tell that changes what she saw." "There's always a story," Julian said, his voice hardening into the tone Elena had heard so many times before, the tone of a man who believed reality could be managed like a business problem. "We say it was a moment of weakness, a mistake neither of us intended, something that happened once and never again. People forgive mistakes. They don't forgive plots." "It wasn't a mistake," Camille said quietly, and something in her voice made Julian go still. "It's been happening for months, Julian. You know that." "I know that. Don't you dare stand here and call it a mistake, as if we tripped and fell into each other by accident." Julian's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, because there was nothing honest to say that would not make things worse. "I need to go home," Camille said, reaching for the door handle. "I can't sit in this car pretending we're solving a problem instead of facing what we did." "Camille." "No," she said, stepping out into the cool night air. "I loved her too, Julian. That's the part you never seem to understand. This wasn't only your betrayal. It was mine too, and I have to live with that in a way you clearly don't plan to." She walked away without looking back, leaving Julian alone in the driver's seat, staring at his own reflection in the rearview mirror, as though searching for the man he used to believe himself to be. Back inside the ballroom, the evening slowly wound toward its end, though nothing about it resembled the celebration it was meant to be. Guests began drifting toward the exits in twos and threes, some offering Elena quiet words of sympathy, others avoiding her eyes entirely, uncertain how to behave around a scandal they had witnessed, but did not fully understand. Elena's closest cousin, Margaret, a woman known throughout the family for her blunt honesty, finally approached with none of the careful hesitation others had shown. "You did nothing wrong tonight," Margaret said, taking both of Elena's hands in hers. "Do you hear me? Nothing. He did this. She did this. You simply refused to pretend it didn't happen, and there is no shame in that, no matter what anyone in this room whispers behind their champagne glasses." Elena squeezed her cousin's hands gratefully, grateful for at least one voice that offered clarity instead of pity. As the room continued to empty, Elena found herself near the tall windows, needing a moment away from the sympathetic faces and curious stares, needing simply to breathe without an audience watching her do it. The city stretched out below in a haze of lights, indifferent to the wreckage of her evening, and for the first time since walking into that private lounge and finding Julian's hand on Camille's back, she allowed herself to cry, quietly, without performance, without anyone watching. Except someone was watching. The man in the dark suit had risen from his table and crossed the room without drawing attention to himself, and now he stood a respectful distance away, close enough to speak but far enough to leave her the privacy to decide whether she wanted company. "I won't pretend to know what tonight has cost you," he said, his voice low and measured, carrying none of the false sympathy she had grown so weary of hearing. "But I will say this. In a room full of people eager to whisper about your misfortune, you were the only person tonight who behaved with any real dignity." Elena turned, startled, wiping quickly at her eyes, though there was no disguising that she had been crying. "I'm sorry. Do I know you?" "Not yet," he said, and something in the simplicity of the answer struck her as strangely honest. "My name is Nathaniel Ashbourne. I came tonight as a guest of your father's associate, Mr. Whitfield, though I confess, I now feel somewhat like an intruder on a private matter." "You're not an intruder," Elena said, surprising herself with how easily the words came. "Everyone else in this room seems to think my private matter is public entertainment. At least you had the decency to wait until I noticed you before commenting." A faint, almost reluctant smile touched the corner of his mouth. "I have little patience for cruelty dressed up as concern, Miss Marsh. I watched two women near the bar discuss your evening, as though it were a stage play written for their amusement. I found it difficult to remain silent, though I recognized it was not my place to intervene." Elena studied him for a long moment, uncertain what to make of a stranger who spoke with such quiet conviction, who seemed entirely unbothered by the scandal swirling around her, as though her worth had nothing to do with the failures of the man who had betrayed her. "Why does it matter to you?" she asked. "You don't know me. You have no reason to care how this room treats me." Nathaniel considered the question seriously, as though it deserved more than a casual answer. "Perhaps because I have spent a great deal of my life in rooms exactly like this one, watching people decide a person's worth, based on gossip rather than character. I find I have grown tired of staying silent, simply because it is easier." Before Elena could respond, her mother appeared at her side, offering Nathaniel a polite but curious nod, before turning her attention to her daughter. "Elena, darling, I think it's time we headed home." Elena glanced back at Nathaniel, uncertain how to end a conversation that felt unfinished in a way she could not quite explain. "Thank you," she said simply, "for not looking at me the way everyone else did tonight." "You have nothing to thank me for," Nathaniel replied. "I only saw clearly what was already there." As she walked away with her mother, Elena did not look back, though something in her chest had shifted slightly, some small and unexpected warmth settling into the hollow space where her heartbreak had been sitting all evening. She did not yet understand that this brief conversation by the windows was only the beginning of something far larger, something that would unfold over the coming months in ways she could not possibly have predicted on the worst night of her engagement. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the story of Elena's engagement party had already traveled far beyond the walls of the Grandview Hotel. Phones buzzed across the city, with messages passed from friend to friend, each retelling adding a small exaggeration, a slight twist, until the truth had become something closer to legend than fact. In some versions, Elena had thrown an entire tray of glasses. In others, she had screamed loud enough to be heard in the parking lot. The details changed with each telling, but the core of the story remained the same, and it was a story that placed her at its center, whether she wanted to be there or not. Elena spent the morning curled on her sofa, staring at her phone, as message after message arrived, some from concerned friends, others from acquaintances, who seemed less interested in her well-being than in extracting fresh details for their own retelling. She ignored most of them, unable to summon the energy to explain herself to people who had already decided what kind of story they wanted to believe. Her mother, ever practical in a crisis, arrived at her apartment by mid-morning with a bag of groceries and a look of fierce determination. "You are not hiding in here for the next month," Diane announced, setting the bag down on the kitchen counter with more force than necessary. "I did not raise a daughter who disappears because two selfish people decided to behave badly." "It's not about hiding," Elena said, though the words felt hollow, even as she spoke them. "I just don't know how to walk back into the world today, Mom. Everyone knows. Everyone has an opinion. I feel like I'm wearing my heartbreak on my skin for anyone to see." Diane sat down beside her daughter, taking Elena's hands in hers the same way Margaret had done the night before. "Let me tell you something about heartbreak, darling. It does not announce itself the way you think it does. Most people are far too busy with their own lives to think about yours, for more than an afternoon." The ones who linger on your pain longer than that. The ones who want to keep talking about it for weeks. Those are not people worth your worry. Their opinions say more about them than they ever will about you. Elena managed a small, tired smile. You always know exactly what to say. I've had considerably more practice at being your mother than you've had at surviving a broken engagement, Diane said dryly. Now, eat something. You cannot fight the world on an empty stomach. And today, my dear, you have several fights ahead of you. The first of those fights arrived less than an hour later, in the form of a phone call from Camille. Elena stared at the screen for a long moment before answering, unsure whether she wanted to hear whatever excuse her former best friend had prepared. Please don't hang up, Camille said, the moment the call connected, her voice thick with what sounded like genuine remorse, though Elena had learned the hard way that sincerity and performance could wear the same mask. I know I have no right to call you. I know there's nothing I can say that fixes what I did. I just needed you to know that I never meant for this to happen, that it wasn't planned, that I hate myself more than you could ever hate me. I don't hate you, Camille, Elena said quietly, and she meant it, though the admission surprised her even as she said it. I loved you. That's the part that hurts more than anything Julian did. He was supposed to love me. You were supposed to be the one person who never turned against me. I know, Camille whispered. I know. And I have no excuse that makes any of it right. It started small, months ago, just conversations after you'd gone to bed early or missed a dinner because of work. And I told myself it meant nothing. And then it became something I couldn't stop even though every part of me knew it was wrong. You could have stopped, Elena said. You had 100 chances to stop, Camille. Every single day, you chose to keep seeing him instead. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Elena wondered if the call had dropped. You're right, Camille finally said. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even know if I want you to, because some part of me thinks I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to hear it from me, instead of from someone twisting the story into something even uglier than it already is. Thank you for that much at least, Elena said, and she found she meant this too, even as the wound in her chest throbbed with fresh pain. But I need you to understand something, Camille. This isn't a conversation we're going to have again. Whatever we were to each other, it ended the moment you touched what belonged to me. I wish you well in whatever comes next for you, but I can't have you in my life anymore. I understand, Camille said, her voice barely above a whisper now. I'm sorry, Elena. I'm so sorry. The call ended, and Elena sat with the phone still in her hand, feeling the strange mixture of grief and relief that comes from closing a door that has been hanging open and swinging in the wind for far too long. Julian's attempts at contact were considerably less remorseful. His first message arrived that afternoon, framed as a request to meet and discuss things calmly, as though the events of the previous night had been a business dispute rather than a betrayal of everything they had built together. When Elena did not respond, his messages grew increasingly frustrated, shifting from requests to demands, then finally to something that sounded almost like a threat. You're making this harder than it needs to be, one message read. People are already talking about how dramatic you were last night. If you keep refusing to talk, you're only going to make yourself look worse. Elena read the message twice, feeling something cold settle in her stomach. Even now, even after everything, Julian's primary concern remained his own image, his own comfort, his own need to control the narrative rather than face the consequences of what he had done. She did not respond. Instead, she blocked his number, then sat back against her sofa cushions and allowed herself, for the first time since the party, to feel something other than grief. She felt anger, clean, clarifying anger, the kind that did not consume her but instead seemed to burn away some of the fog of heartbreak, leaving behind a clearer sense of exactly what she deserved and exactly what she would no longer tolerate. 3 days later, Elena returned to work at Larkspur Events, the boutique event planning company, where she had built her career over the past 6 years. She had considered taking additional time off, but the thought of sitting alone in her apartment, with nothing but her own thoughts for company, had felt more unbearable than facing her colleagues. Her business partner and closest friend at the company, a sharp-witted woman named Priya Nair, met her at the door with a cup of coffee and an expression that held no trace of pity, only solidarity. I heard, Priya said simply, handing over the coffee. I'm not going to pretend I didn't, and I'm not going to make you talk about it if you don't want to. But I want you to know, that this office is the one place in this city where nobody is going to whisper about you behind your back. Anyone who tries will answer to me." Elena laughed, a real laugh, the first one since the party, and felt something in her chest loosen slightly. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Priya." "You'd survive," Priya said, waving a hand dismissively. "You're the strongest person I know. But you'd be considerably less caffeinated, and honestly, considerably less entertained at staff meetings." Work, Elena discovered, offered its own kind of medicine. There was comfort in problems that had clear solutions, in seating charts and vendor contracts and timeline spreadsheets, tasks that asked nothing of her heart and everything of her competence. By the end of her first week back, she had thrown herself into planning a large charity gala scheduled for the following month, one of the most significant events Larkspur had ever been contracted to organize, and the sheer scale of the work left little room for dwelling on her broken engagement. It was during a planning meeting for this very gala that Elena encountered an unexpected name on the guest list. "The gala's primary sponsor this year is the Ashbourne Foundation," Priya explained, scrolling through her tablet as they reviewed logistics in the conference room. "Apparently the Duke himself is quite involved in choosing which charities his foundation supports. He's expected to attend in person." Elena felt her breath catch slightly at the name, memories of the tall stranger by the windows returning with unexpected clarity. She had thought of him more than once, in the days since the party, had wondered whether their brief conversation had meant anything at all, or whether she had simply imagined kindness where there was only polite formality. "Do you know him?" Priya asked, catching the flicker of recognition on Elena's face. "We met briefly," Elena said, keeping her tone carefully neutral. "At my engagement party, actually, before everything fell apart." Priya's eyebrows rose with interest, though she was tactful enough not to press further, filing the information away with the promise of future teasing, once Elena's heart had healed enough to withstand it. Over the following weeks, as the gala's planning progressed, Elena found herself exchanging occasional emails with representatives from the Ashbourne Foundation regarding sponsorship details, seating arrangements, and speaking opportunities. Most of these communications came from foundation staff rather than the Duke himself, but on one occasion, a short message arrived signed simply with his name, thanking her for the thoroughness of her planning documents and expressing confidence that the event would be a success under her direction. It was a small gesture, professional and unremarkable on its surface, but Elena found herself reading the message more than once, searching for something beyond its polite formality, some echo of the man who had stood beside her at the windows and refused to look at her with pity. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself she was simply grateful for one person's basic decency during the worst week of her life. But as the date of the gala drew closer, she found herself thinking of Nathaniel Ashbourne more often than she cared to admit, wondering what it would be like to see him again, wondering whether the quiet steadiness she had glimpsed in him that night had been genuine, or simply a trick of circumstance and grief making her imagination generous toward a stranger. She did not yet know that Nathaniel had been asking quiet questions of his own, gathering information about the woman who had stood so straight-backed amid public humiliation, learning of her reputation for excellence in her work, her fierce loyalty to those she loved, and the quiet dignity with which she had rebuilt her life in the weeks following her shattered engagement. He did not yet know how the story would unfold between them, but he had already decided, somewhere in the quiet hours after that party, that he would not let their paths cross only once. The charity gala was scheduled to take place at the Ashbourne Foundation's own Grand Hall, a building known throughout the city for its towering columns and its history of hosting events that raised considerable sums for hospitals, schools, and community programs. For Elena, the assignment represented both an enormous opportunity and an enormous risk. A successful gala under her direction would cement Larkspur Events as a company capable of handling the most prestigious clients in the city. A failure would confirm every whisper that had followed her since her engagement collapsed, every quiet suggestion that her personal troubles had left her distracted and unreliable. She poured herself into the preparations, with a focus that left little room for anything else. Seating charts were revised a dozen times to avoid awkward pairings among the city's most prominent families. Menus were tested and retested to accommodate dietary requirements without sacrificing elegance. Lighting designers were consulted, musicians auditioned, and 100 small decisions made that would, in the end, determine whether the evening felt effortless or chaotic to the guests who would never see the work behind it. 2 weeks before the gala, Elena was called to the Ashbourne Foundation offices for a final walkthrough of the venue, accompanied by Priya and a small team from Larkspur. She had expected to meet with Foundation staff, as she had throughout the planning process, and was unprepared for the moment the office door opened to reveal Nathaniel Ashbourne himself, standing beside a large table covered in architectural drawings of the Grand Hall. "Miss Marsh," he said, and something in the way he said her name, formal yet unmistakably warm, sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. "Thank you for coming personally. I wanted to review a few details with the person actually responsible for the evening's success, rather than relying entirely on second-hand reports." "Of course, Your Grace," Elena said, falling into the practiced formality she used with important clients, though she found it strangely difficult to maintain the same careful distance she managed with everyone else. "Nathaniel is fine," he said, a faint smile touching his mouth. "I find the title tends to create more distance than I care for, particularly with people whose work I genuinely admire." Priya, standing slightly behind Elena, exchanged a quick glance with one of the junior planners, though she was careful to keep her expression professionally neutral. The walkthrough proceeded much as any client meeting might, though Elena found herself increasingly aware of small details. The way Nathaniel listened with genuine attention, rather than the distracted half-interest she had grown accustomed to from wealthy clients. The way he asked thoughtful questions about accessibility for elderly guests and dietary accommodations for children attending with their families. Details that revealed a man who cared about the people the gala was meant to serve, rather than simply the spectacle of the evening itself. "You've thought of everything," Nathaniel observed as they reached the final section of the walkthrough, standing near the Grand Hall's tall windows that overlooked the Foundation's gardens below. "I confess, I've worked with a number of event planners over the years, and few have shown the thoroughness you've brought to this project." "It matters to me," Elena said simply. "This gala isn't just an evening of entertainment for wealthy donors. It's funding that will help real people, families who need it. I want every detail to honor that." Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "That's precisely the difference between someone who does this work for a paycheck and someone who does it because they believe in what it accomplishes. I noticed the same quality in you the night we met, Miss Marsh, though the circumstances were considerably less pleasant." Elena felt heat rise to her cheeks, uncertain whether it came from embarrassment or something warmer. "I appreciate you not bringing that evening up in front of my colleagues." "I would never," he said, his tone suddenly serious. "What happened to you that night was not a story for gossip, Miss Marsh. It was an injustice, and I have little patience for treating injustice as entertainment." Priya cleared her throat gently from across the room, a subtle reminder that the walkthrough still had several items remaining on its agenda, and the moment passed, though Elena found herself carrying the weight of his words with her for the rest of the day. In the weeks that followed, Elena and Nathaniel's professional correspondence continued, though it gradually began to include details that extended beyond the gala itself. A conversation about seating arrangements might drift into a brief exchange about a book Elena had mentioned reading. A discussion about the evening's musical program might include Nathaniel's own memories of learning piano as a child, memories offered with a rare vulnerability that suggested he did not share such things easily. Elena told herself, repeatedly, that these exchanges meant nothing beyond ordinary professional courtesy. She reminded herself that she had barely recovered from one heartbreak and had no business entertaining thoughts of another entanglement, particularly with a man whose position in society placed him worlds away from her own. But despite her best efforts at caution, she found herself looking forward to his messages with an eagerness she had not felt in longer than she cared to admit. Meanwhile, word of Elena's growing professional relationship with the Ashbourne Foundation had begun to circulate through the same social circles that had whispered about her broken engagement weeks earlier. Where once the gossip had painted her as a woman scorned, now a different narrative began to take shape, one that suggested Elena had somehow orchestrated her proximity to the Duke as a calculated career move, a suggestion that infuriated Elena when it eventually reached her ears through a well-meaning but tactless acquaintance. "People are saying you're trying to climb your way into his circle," the acquaintance, a woman named Charlotte who had attended university with Elena, mentioned one afternoon over coffee, her tone carrying the particular relish of someone delivering unwelcome news under the guise of concern. "I told them it wasn't true, of course, but you know how people talk." "I'm doing my job, Charlotte," Elena said evenly, though the accusation stung more than she wanted to admit. The foundation is a client, nothing more. Of course, Charlotte said, though her expression suggested she did not entirely believe it. Still, you might want to be careful. Men like that rarely take working women seriously as anything more than temporary amusement, no matter how well they treat you in meetings. Elena said nothing further on the subject, though the conversation left a bitter residue that lingered long after Charlotte had gone. Another reminder that no matter how carefully she conducted herself, the world seemed determined to reduce her choices to scandal, calculation, or foolishness, never simply the honest pursuit of her own career and her own healing. It was against this backdrop of renewed gossip that Julian resurfaced, unexpectedly and unwelcome, at a smaller industry event Elena attended in her professional capacity, 3 weeks before the gala. She had not seen him since the night of the engagement party, had taken pains to avoid any event where their paths might cross, but the industry mixer had been organized by a client she could not afford to disappoint, and she arrived without any warning that Julian, now working in a business development role for a company attending the same event, would be present as well. He approached her near the refreshment table, his expression carrying an unsettling mixture of confidence and desperation that Elena had never seen in him before. "You look well," he said, as though the months since their last conversation had been nothing more than an ordinary gap between friendly acquaintances. "Julian," Elena said, keeping her voice cool and controlled, refusing to give him the reaction he seemed to be searching for. "I'd prefer we kept this professional, given the circumstances." "I heard you've been spending quite a bit of time with the Duke," Julian said, ignoring her request entirely, his tone taking on an edge that made Elena's guard rise instantly. "Careful, Elena. Men like that don't marry women like you. You're good enough to plan his parties, not good enough to sit at his table." The cruelty of the comment landed with more force than Elena expected, precisely because it echoed the same insecurities that had haunted her long before Julian's betrayal. Insecurities about her worth, her place in a world of wealth and status she had never quite felt she belonged to. But something had changed in her since the night of the engagement party, some quiet resilience that had grown stronger with every difficult conversation she had survived in the weeks since. "Whatever happens between the Duke and me is none of your concern anymore, Julian," she said, her voice steady, despite the sting of his words. "You lost the right to comment on my life the moment you chose Camille over the promises you made to me. I suggest you spend less time worrying about my future and more time reflecting on why you couldn't keep the one you already had." She walked away without waiting for his response, her heart pounding but her steps steady, and though his words echoed unpleasantly in her mind for the rest of the evening, she found herself grateful, in a strange way, for the encounter. It had shown her precisely how far she had come, how much stronger she had grown, since the night her world had shattered in front of a room full of strangers, and how little power Julian's opinion still held over the choices she intended to make for herself. She did not yet know that within the month, at the very gala she had spent weeks perfecting, Nathaniel Ashbourne would make a declaration in front of an entire room of guests that would silence every whisper of doubt anyone had ever dared to speak about her worth. The night of the gala arrived with a clear sky and a soft autumn chill that seemed, to Elena, almost too perfect for an evening she had spent weeks worrying over. She arrived at the Ashbourne Foundation's Grand Hall hours before the guests, moving through the space with a clipboard in hand, checking every table setting, every floral arrangement, every note in the evening's program, with the meticulous attention that had built her reputation over 6 years in the industry. Priya found her near the stage where the evening's musicians were completing their final sound check, adjusting a stray strand of hair that had escaped Elena's carefully arranged updo. "You look like you're about to walk into battle, not host a charity gala," Priya said, amusement threading through her concern. "I feel like I am," Elena admitted, allowing herself a brief moment of honesty. "This is the biggest event of my career, Priya. If tonight goes well, we could see contracts from half the city's most prominent families. If it goes badly—" "It's not going to go badly," Priya interrupted firmly. "You've planned this evening down to the second. Every contingency has a backup plan. You've done everything within your control, and the rest is simply luck and the goodwill of people who've come here to enjoy themselves, not to judge a seating chart." Elena managed a small laugh, grateful, not for the first time, for Priya's steady presence throughout the most difficult months of her life. "What would I do without you?" Panic, Considerably more than you already are, Priya said, squeezing Elena's shoulder before returning to oversee the final preparations in the kitchen. By 7 o'clock, the grand hall had transformed into precisely the vision Elena had spent weeks perfecting. Its towering windows draped in soft golden light, its tables adorned with understated elegance rather than ostentatious display, its atmosphere carefully calibrated to feel both celebratory and meaningful, a balance Elena had insisted upon from the very first planning meeting. Guests began arriving in a steady stream, the city's most prominent families mingling with foundation staff, local business leaders, and representatives from the various charities the evening's proceeds would benefit. Elena moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency, greeting guests, resolving small logistical questions, and generally ensuring the evening proceeded without a single visible flaw. Though internally, she remained acutely aware of every table she passed, every conversation she overheard, watching for any sign of the whispered gossip that had followed her for months. She did not have to wait long to find it. Near the entrance to the grand hall, standing with a drink in hand as though he belonged among the invited guests, Elena spotted Julian, dressed in a tailored suit, and speaking animatedly, with a small group of businessmen she recognized as clients of his company. Her stomach dropped, a familiar wave of dread rising in her chest at the unwelcome sight of him, at an event meant to represent everything she had rebuilt in the months since their engagement collapsed. Priya appeared at her side almost instantly, having followed her gaze. "I didn't know he was invited. He wasn't. Not by us," Elena said, her jaw tightening. "His company must have purchased tickets through the general sale. I should have anticipated this." "Do you want me to have him removed?" Priya asked, her protective instincts flaring immediately. Elena considered the question, weighing the potential scandal of a public confrontation against the discomfort of simply enduring his presence for the remainder of the evening. "No," she finally said. "That would only give people something new to whisper about. Let him stay. I refuse to let his presence disrupt the work I've done tonight." She turned away, determined not to let Julian's unwelcome appearance derail her focus, and threw herself back into the demands of hosting, greeting arriving guests with a warmth that betrayed none of the unease coiling in her stomach. It was nearly an hour later, during the evening's cocktail reception, that Elena encountered Nathaniel for the first time that night. He emerged from a conversation with several Foundation board members, his dark formal attire striking against the golden light of the grand hall, and something in his expression, warm and unmistakably admiring, momentarily steadied the anxiety that had been building in her chest since spotting Julian. "The hall looks remarkable," Nathaniel said, his gaze sweeping across the room before returning to her. "I don't believe I've ever seen this space transformed so completely. You should be proud of what you've accomplished here, Miss Marsh." "Elena," she corrected softly, surprising herself with the invitation. Something shifted in his expression at the small permission, a warmth that reached his eyes in a way that made Elena's pulse quicken, despite the chaos of the evening surrounding them. "Elena," he repeated, as though testing the shape of her name. "I have something I'd like to discuss with you before the evening concludes, if you can spare a few minutes away from your duties." Before Elena could respond, a commotion near the entrance drew both their attention. Julian, apparently emboldened by several drinks and the sight of Elena speaking comfortably with the evening's most prominent host, had approached with an expression that suggested he intended to make a scene of his own. "Elena," Julian called out, loud enough to draw the attention of nearby guests. "I didn't realize you'd climbed quite this high since our engagement ended. Should I be impressed, or simply concerned for the Duke's reputation?" The nearby conversations fell silent, guests turning toward the unfolding scene, with the same curious hunger Elena remembered from the night of her engagement party. Her stomach twisted with humiliation, the familiar sensation of being watched, judged, and whispered about threatening to overwhelm the confidence she had worked so hard to rebuild. But this time, something was different. Nathaniel stepped forward, his expression calm but unmistakably firm, positioning himself slightly in front of Elena in a gesture that felt protective without being possessive. "I don't believe we've been introduced," he said, his voice carrying easily across the suddenly quiet room, though its tone remained perfectly composed. "Though I confess I've heard a great deal about you, none of it particularly flattering." Julian's confidence faltered slightly under the weight of Nathaniel's steady gaze. "I'm simply an old friend of Elena's, catching up." An old friend who publicly humiliated her at her own engagement celebration, if my understanding is correct, Nathaniel said, his tone still calm, but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority that seemed to still the room further. I find it curious that you would choose to attend an event meant to benefit families in genuine need, only to spend your evening attempting to embarrass the woman responsible for its success. A murmur rippled through the gathered guests, and Elena watched, stunned, as Julian's confident posture crumbled under the public weight of Nathaniel's words. "I don't see how this concerns you," Julian said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier bravado. "It concerns me," Nathaniel said, taking a measured step closer, "because Elena Marsh is not simply the planner of this evening's gala. She is a woman of remarkable talent, integrity, and grace, qualities I have had the privilege of observing over the past several months, as we've worked together on this foundation's behalf. And I find myself increasingly unwilling to stand by while lesser men attempt to diminish her worth, simply because they lacked the character to recognize it when they had the chance." The room had gone entirely silent now. Every guest turned toward the unfolding scene, and Elena felt her heart pounding with a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and something else entirely, something warm and overwhelming that she could not quite name. Julian, recognizing the futility of continuing the confrontation in front of an audience so clearly unsympathetic to his cause, offered a stiff, humiliated nod before turning and making his way toward the exit, his earlier confidence entirely evaporated. The room remained quiet for a long moment after his departure, guests exchanging uncertain glances, uncertain whether the evening's drama had concluded, or whether more remained to unfold. Nathaniel turned to Elena, his expression softening from the firm authority he had shown Julian into something gentler, more vulnerable than she had ever seen from him. "I apologize if I overstepped," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "I simply could not stand by and watch him treat you that way again. Not after everything I've come to know about you these past months." Elena stared at him, overwhelmed by the events of the last several minutes, uncertain how to process the public defense that had just unfolded in front of an entire ballroom of the city's most prominent citizens. "You didn't overstep," she managed finally. "You defended me in a way no one ever has before, not even the people who were supposed to love me most." Nathaniel's expression shifted again, something resolute settling into his features, and before Elena fully understood what was happening, he had turned to address the room at large, his voice carrying clearly across the silent hall. "I find myself compelled to say something further this evening," he announced, and the room, already quiet, seemed to hold its breath entirely. "For months, I have watched this remarkable woman navigate public humiliation with more grace and dignity than I have seen from anyone in my considerable experience among society's most privileged circles. I have watched her rebuild her career, her confidence, and her sense of self, entirely on her own strength, without asking for pity or special treatment from anyone in this room." Elena's heart pounded so loudly she wondered if the entire hall could hear it, uncertain what Nathaniel intended to say next, uncertain whether she was prepared for whatever declaration seemed to be building in his words. "I have spent considerable time in this life avoiding declarations of this nature," Nathaniel continued, "believing my position required a certain reserve, a certain distance from the ordinary vulnerabilities of the heart. But I find I no longer wish to hide behind that reserve, particularly not when the woman standing beside me has shown more courage in the face of public cruelty than anyone I have encountered in years." He turned to face her fully now, and Elena felt the weight of every eye in the room settling upon them both, though somehow, in this moment, she found she did not care. "Elena Marsh," Nathaniel said, his voice steady, despite the magnitude of what he was clearly preparing to say, "I would like, with your permission, to court you properly, openly, without hiding behind the pretense of professional correspondence any longer. I recognize the timing may seem unconventional, and I recognize you may need time to consider whether you wish to entertain the interest of a man you have known only a matter of months. But I did not wish to spend another day watching you carry the weight of other people's cruelty, without knowing that at least one person in this city recognizes your worth clearly, and wishes to spend considerably more time earning the privilege of standing beside you." The room erupted into a soft murmur of astonishment, guests exchanging stunned glances, several reaching for their phones despite the evident inappropriateness of documenting such a private moment unfolding in so public a setting. Elena stood frozen, overwhelmed by the enormity of what had just occurred, the public declaration unfolding in front of the very people who had whispered so cruelly about her only months before. She searched Nathaniel's face for any sign of performance, any indication that his words were motivated by anything other than genuine feeling, and found only quiet sincerity staring back at her. "I need a moment," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is considerably more than I expected tonight." "Of course," Nathaniel said immediately, stepping back slightly to give her space, though his eyes never left hers. "Take whatever time you need, Elena. I am not asking for an answer this evening. I simply needed you to hear the truth spoken plainly, in front of everyone, rather than whispered quietly where doubt might convince you it was never truly meant." Elena turned and walked toward the quiet of the terrace outside the grand hall, her mind racing with the events of the past several minutes, uncertain how to process a declaration so unexpected, so entirely different from anything she had experienced with Julian, whose affections had always seemed conditional upon her ability to remain small enough not to threaten his own sense of importance. She did not yet know how she would answer Nathaniel's declaration, but standing alone beneath the autumn stars, feeling the cool night air against her flushed cheeks, she understood one thing with absolute clarity. For the first time since the night her engagement shattered in front of a room full of strangers, she felt something other than heartbreak, something other than the exhausting effort of simply surviving each day. She felt hope. The days following the gala passed in a strange blur for Elena, caught between the professional triumph of an evening that had raised more money for the foundation's charities than any previous year, and the personal upheaval of a public declaration that seemed to have rewritten the story the city told about her overnight. Where once the whispers had painted her as a woman scorned, abandoned, and perhaps somehow deserving of her fiancé's betrayal, now an entirely different narrative circulated through the same social circles, one that framed her as the object of a duke's genuine admiration, a woman whose grace under pressure had captured the attention of one of the city's most eligible and respected men. Elena found herself troubled by how easily the narrative had shifted, how quickly the same voices that had condemned her now seemed eager to celebrate her, as though her worth had only become visible once a powerful man had confirmed it publicly. "It shouldn't matter what they think either way," Priya observed one afternoon, as the two of them reviewed the gala's financial reports in the quiet of the Larkspur offices. "But I understand why it bothers you. It's frustrating to realize your value in other people's eyes depends entirely on whose attention you've captured, rather than on your own accomplishments." "Exactly," Elena said, setting down her pen with a frustrated sigh. "I planned a gala that raised more money than any event Larkspur has ever produced. I rebuilt my entire life after Julian's betrayal without anyone's help, but suddenly, because a duke said some kind words in a crowded room, I'm treated like I've finally achieved something worth respecting. So don't let their opinions be the measure of your worth," Priya said simply. "You know what you've accomplished. You know the strength it took to get here. Let the gossips think whatever they want. Their approval was never something you needed in the first place." Elena appreciated the wisdom in her friend's words, though she found the practical application considerably more difficult than the advice itself suggested. The following week, she received an invitation to a small dinner at the Ashbourne estate, extended personally by Nathaniel, rather than through any formal channel, along with a handwritten note expressing his hope that she might have found the space she needed to consider his earlier declaration, and his willingness to accept whatever answer she had reached, even if that answer was not the one he hoped for. She arrived at the Ashbourne estate on a cool evening in late autumn, the grand house illuminated softly against the darkening sky, considerably more intimate in scale than she had expected from a family of such prominence. Nathaniel met her at the door personally, dressed more casually than she had ever seen him, and something in the simplicity of his welcome eased the nervousness that had been building throughout her drive to the estate. "Thank you for coming," he said, leading her through a modest but elegant entryway toward a small dining room, considerably less grand than the ballrooms and galas where their acquaintance had thus far unfolded. "I thought perhaps a quieter setting might allow us to speak more honestly than we've managed thus far." Over a simple but carefully prepared dinner, Elena found herself sharing details of her life she had rarely discussed with anyone. Her childhood ambitions, the long hours she had poured into building her career, the insecurities Julian's betrayal had reopened, wounds she had believed long healed, from years of subtle criticism about her ambition, making her somehow less desirable as a partner. Nathaniel listened with the same careful attention he had shown throughout their professional correspondence, asking thoughtful questions rather than offering easy reassurances, and gradually, Elena found herself sharing something she had not admitted even to Priya or her own mother. "I'm frightened," she confessed quietly, setting down her fork. "Not of you exactly, but of what it means to consider caring for someone again, after everything that happened with Julian. I built my entire sense of safety around a relationship that turned out to be built on nothing at all. I don't know how to trust that kind of feeling again." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, considering her words with the same seriousness he brought to every conversation between them. "I won't pretend to offer you guarantees, Elena. I cannot promise you a love without risk, because I don't believe such a thing exists. What I can promise you is honesty, patience, and a willingness to earn your trust slowly, rather than expecting you to hand it over, simply because I made a public declaration in a crowded ballroom." "That declaration terrified me," Elena admitted, a small, reluctant smile touching her lips. "I don't think anyone has ever spoken about me with such certainty in front of so many people." "I meant every word," Nathaniel said simply, "though I recognize the manner of my declaration was perhaps more suited to grand gestures than to the quiet, patient courtship you deserve. If you're willing, I would like the chance to court you properly now, away from crowded rooms and public spectacle, simply as two people learning whether what we've begun to feel for each other might grow into something lasting." Elena studied him across the table, searching once more for any hint of performance in his words, and found only the same quiet sincerity that had drawn her to him from their very first conversation, by the windows of the Grandview Hotel. "I would like that," she said finally, feeling something loosen in her chest that had remained tightly wound since the night of her broken engagement. "But I need you to understand something, Nathaniel. I'm not the same woman I was before Julian's betrayal. I've learned to protect myself, to question easy declarations, to demand honesty, rather than accepting comfortable lies. If we do this, I need you to be patient with the parts of me that are still healing." "I would expect nothing less," Nathaniel said, reaching across the table to take her hand gently, the first time he had touched her with such deliberate intention. "And I would consider it a privilege, Elena, to help you rebuild your trust, one honest conversation at a time." In the weeks that followed, their relationship unfolded with a gentleness that Elena had never experienced with Julian, whose affections had always felt conditional upon her availability, her compliance, her willingness to shrink herself to accommodate his ego. Nathaniel, by contrast, seemed genuinely interested in her opinions, her ambitions, her small daily victories at work, listening with an attentiveness that made her feel, for the first time in years, truly seen rather than simply tolerated. They spent quiet evenings walking through the city's parks, away from the formal galas and society dinners where Nathaniel's public role typically demanded his presence. They discussed books, disagreed occasionally about politics with a mutual respect that neither had expected to find so easily. And gradually, Elena found the wounds Julian's betrayal had opened beginning to close, replaced not by forgetting what had happened, but by the slow, steady accumulation of evidence that not every man treated love as a tool for control. Not everyone in Elena's life greeted the growing relationship with unqualified enthusiasm. Her father, though pleased to see his daughter's happiness returning, expressed quiet concern about the practical challenges of a relationship spanning such different worlds. "I only want to be certain you've considered what this means, Elena," Richard Marsh said one evening, as they sat together in the quiet of her parents' living room. "A life alongside a man like Nathaniel Ashbourne carries certain expectations, certain scrutiny, that a woman of our more modest background may find considerably more burdensome than the glamour suggests." "I've thought about it, Dad," Elena said gently, "but I've also learned something important these past months. I spent years shrinking myself to fit into Julian's expectations, and it nearly destroyed me when the truth of his character finally surfaced. I refuse to make that mistake again, regardless of who I choose to love. If Nathaniel and I build something together, it will be because he accepts me exactly as I am, ambition and all, not because I've learned to make myself smaller to fit his world." Her father studied her for a long moment, something like pride settling into his expression. "Then I suppose I have nothing further to worry about," he said finally. "You've grown considerably wiser than the daughter who walked into that engagement party 6 months ago." Elena smiled, grateful for her father's support, and found herself reflecting on just how far she had traveled since that terrible night. from a woman shattered by public betrayal, to someone rebuilding her life on her own terms, discovering along the way that genuine love, when it finally arrived, looked nothing like the anxious, conditional affection she had mistaken for devotion during her years with Julian. She did not yet know that within a matter of months, Nathaniel would ask her a question that would require her to decide, once and for all, whether she was ready to build a life entirely different from the one she had once imagined for herself. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing the city, in a chill that seemed to match the sense of quiet transformation settling over Elena's life. Larkspur events had grown considerably in the months since the gala, new contracts arriving weekly from clients who had witnessed the flawless execution of the Ashbourne Foundation's charity evening, and Elena found herself busier than she had ever been, though the work no longer felt like an escape from her personal life so much as a genuine source of pride and purpose. Priya had been promoted to full partner at the company, a decision Elena had pushed for the moment the gala's success became clear, unwilling to let her friends' contributions go unrecognized any longer. Together they hired 2 additional planners to manage the growing client list, and Elena found herself, for the first time in her career, stepping into a role that involved mentoring others, rather than simply executing every detail herself. "You're becoming quite the leader," Priya observed one afternoon, watching Elena patiently walk one of their newer employees through the complexities of managing a difficult client's shifting demands. "I remember when you used to handle every single detail yourself, because you didn't trust anyone else to do it right. I learned the hard way that trying to control everything alone isn't strength," Elena said, thinking of the months following Julian's betrayal, when she had believed she needed to handle every emotion, every setback, entirely on her own. Sometimes real strength means letting other people help carry the weight. Her relationship with Nathaniel had continued to deepen through the winter months, though both had been careful to keep the pace deliberate, unhurried, allowing trust to build gradually, rather than rushing toward commitments neither felt fully ready to make. Elena had met Nathaniel's extended family on several occasions, finding herself surprised by their warmth, their genuine curiosity about her work, and their evident approval of the way Nathaniel seemed to have changed in her presence, softer somehow, more willing to share the private thoughts he had spent years keeping carefully guarded from public view. Not every encounter from her old life had faded so gracefully, however. In early winter, Elena received an unexpected message from a mutual acquaintance, informing her that Julian's professional reputation had suffered considerably in the months since the gala, his public humiliation at Nathaniel's hands having become something of a cautionary tale among their social circle, a reminder of what happened to men who mistook cruelty for confidence. She felt an unexpected pang of something complicated upon hearing the news. Not quite sympathy, but not quite satisfaction either. A recognition that Julian's downfall, however deserved, did not erase the pain he had caused her, and did not require her celebration to feel complete. Camille, by contrast, had reached out only once more, in a brief message sent in early winter, informing Elena that she had moved to a different city entirely, seeking a fresh start away from the wreckage of the friendship she had destroyed. Elena had read the message with a complicated mixture of relief and lingering grief, mourning not the loss of Camille specifically, but the loss of the trust she had once believed unbreakable between them, a trust she now understood could never be fully restored, regardless of how many apologies Camille might eventually offer. "Do you ever think about forgiving them?" Priya asked one evening, as the 2 friends shared a quiet dinner at Elena's apartment, a rare evening without any pressing work deadlines demanding their attention. Elena considered the question seriously before answering. "I think I've forgiven them, in the sense that I no longer carry anger toward them, the way I did in those first weeks. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean I want either of them back in my life. I've learned that the 2 things can exist separately. I can wish them well from a distance, without ever wanting to be close to them again." "That sounds like wisdom earned the hard way," Priya said gently. "The hardest way possible," Elena agreed, though she found she could speak of the betrayal now, without the sharp, immediate pain that had once accompanied every mention of Julian's name. Time, work, and the slow rebuilding of trust with Nathaniel had done what she once believed impossible, transforming her greatest heartbreak into simply another chapter of her story, painful but no longer defining. As winter began giving way to the first signs of spring, Elena found herself increasingly aware that her relationship with Nathaniel had reached a point where both of them seemed to be considering questions neither had yet spoken aloud. She noticed the careful way he had begun introducing her to more of his professional world, mentioning her by name to important colleagues, including her in discussions about the Foundation's long-term plans, in a manner that suggested he envisioned a future in which her presence in his life extended well beyond casual courtship. One evening in early spring, as they walked together through the same city park where their relationship had first begun to deepen months earlier, Nathaniel grew unusually quiet, his expression thoughtful in a way that made Elena's heart quicken with anticipation she could not quite name. "I've been thinking about something for quite some time now," he said finally, as they paused beside a small pond, the last light of evening reflecting softly on the water's surface. "I recognize we've moved carefully, deliberately, and I've respected the pace you needed after everything you endured. But I find myself increasingly certain of what I want for our future together, Elena, and I no longer wish to keep that certainty to myself." Elena felt her breath catch, a familiar flutter of nervousness mixing with something warmer, steadier than the anxiety she remembered from her early days with Julian, when uncertainty had always seemed to overshadow whatever happiness she felt. "What do you want?" she asked softly, though some part of her already suspected the answer forming in his expression. "I want to build a life with you," Nathaniel said simply, his voice carrying the same quiet conviction she had come to recognize as entirely genuine. Not simply a courtship, not simply a comfortable arrangement between two people who enjoy each other's company, but a genuine partnership, one built on the honesty and patience we've practiced these past months. "I'm not asking you to answer tonight, Elena. I only wanted you to know clearly where my heart has settled, so that when the moment comes for a more formal question, you'll understand it comes from months of certainty, rather than a sudden impulse." Elena studied his face in the fading evening light, searching, as she always did, for any trace of performance or exaggeration, and finding once again only the same steady sincerity that had first drawn her to him amid the wreckage of her broken engagement. "I've been thinking the same thing," she admitted quietly. "I spent so long believing that love required me to shrink myself, to accept less than I deserved, simply because I feared being alone otherwise. You've shown me something entirely different these past months, Nathaniel. You've shown me that love can exist without demanding I disappear to make room for it." Nathaniel reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining gently with hers as they stood beside the quiet pond, the city's evening lights beginning to flicker on around them. "Then perhaps," he said softly, "we're both ready for whatever comes next." Elena smiled, feeling a warmth settle over her that had nothing to do with the mild spring evening, and everything to do with the quiet certainty growing steadily in her chest. She thought, briefly, of the woman who had stood shattered amid broken glass at her engagement party, uncertain whether she would ever trust love again, and marveled at how far she had traveled since that terrible night, rebuilding not just her heart, but her entire understanding of what she deserved from the people who claimed to love her. She did not yet know precisely when or how Nathaniel intended to ask the question both of them now understood was coming, but standing beside him in the quiet spring evening, she found herself entirely unafraid of whatever answer she would eventually give. The proposal, when it finally came, arrived in a manner entirely characteristic of the man Elena had come to know over the past year, thoughtful, genuine, and free of the performance she had once mistaken for romance during her years with Julian. It happened on a warm evening in early summer, nearly a year after the night Elena's engagement had shattered in front of a room full of strangers at the Grandview Hotel. Nathaniel had invited her to a small dinner at his estate, similar to their very first private evening together, and Elena arrived expecting another quiet, comfortable evening, much like the many they had shared throughout their courtship. Instead, she found the estate's garden transformed, string lights woven through the branches of old trees, a small table set beneath an arbor covered in climbing roses, and Nathaniel waiting for her there, dressed simply, his expression carrying a nervousness she had rarely witnessed in the composed, steady man she had come to love. "You've outdone yourself," Elena said, taking in the quiet beauty of the setting, her heart already beginning to race, with anticipation of what the evening might hold. "I wanted tonight to be different," Nathaniel said, guiding her toward the table with a gentleness that had become entirely familiar over their months together. Not a public declaration in a crowded ballroom this time, but something quieter, something meant only for the two of us, though I promise you the sincerity behind it is no less significant. They shared a quiet dinner beneath the roses, the conversation flowing easily between them as it always had, touching on Elena's latest projects at Larkspur, the Foundation's plans for the coming year, small details of their daily lives that had become, over the past year, the comfortable rhythm of a genuine partnership rather than a performance staged for others' approval. It was after dinner, as the evening light softened into dusk and the garden's string lights began to glow more brightly against the darkening sky, that Nathaniel rose from his seat and knelt beside her chair, producing a small velvet box that he opened with hands that trembled slightly, a vulnerability Elena had rarely seen from him. "Elena Marsh," he said, his voice steady, despite the visible nervousness in his hands. "I have spent the past year learning what it means to love someone, not for the image they present to the world, but for the genuine strength and grace they carry through their most difficult moments. I watched you survive public humiliation with more dignity than I have witnessed from anyone in my considerable experience among society's most privileged circles. I watched you rebuild your career, your confidence, and your capacity to trust, entirely through your own strength, refusing to let anyone's cruelty define your worth." Elena felt tears gathering in her eyes, though these were tears entirely different from the ones she had shed on the night of her broken engagement, tears born not of grief, but of overwhelming gratitude for the year of healing and genuine love that had followed that terrible night. "I do not offer you a title or a position in society as the reason to accept this proposal," Nathaniel continued, his voice growing steadier as he spoke. "I offer you my genuine partnership, my respect for your ambitions, and my promise to spend the rest of my life ensuring you never again doubt your own worth, regardless of what challenges we might face together. Elena, will you marry me?" Elena looked down at him, kneeling in the soft evening light of the garden he had transformed for this moment, and felt the last remaining shadows of doubt from her past finally dissolve entirely, replaced by a certainty as steady and warm as the man kneeling before her. "Yes," she said softly, then again, more firmly, as joy overwhelmed her. "Yes, Nathaniel, I will marry you." He rose to slip the ring onto her finger, then gathered her into an embrace that felt like the culmination of everything they had built together over the past year, patient, honest, and entirely free of the conditional affection that had characterized her previous engagement. News of their engagement spread quickly through the same social circles that had once whispered so cruelly about Elena's broken relationship with Julian, though this time, the whispers carried an entirely different tone, admiration rather than pity, respect rather than judgment, though Elena found she cared considerably less about their opinions now than she once had, having learned over the past year that her worth had never depended on their approval in the first place. The wedding took place the following autumn, in the same gardens where Nathaniel had proposed, transformed once again with string lights and climbing roses, though this time surrounded by family and genuine friends, rather than the curious crowds that had witnessed the wreckage of her previous engagement. Elena's father walked her down a simple aisle, lined with autumn flowers, tears in his eyes as he delivered her into a marriage built on genuine respect, rather than the fragile foundation her first engagement had rested upon. Priya served as her maid of honor, a role Camille had once held before betraying the trust Elena had placed in her, and though the absence still carried a quiet echo of grief, Elena found herself grateful for the genuine friendship that had replaced it, a friendship that had proven itself, through the difficult months following her broken engagement, rather than shattering under the weight of temptation. As Elena stood beneath the same arbor where Nathaniel had proposed, exchanging vows with a man who had shown her, patiently and consistently, what genuine love looked like, she found herself reflecting on the strange, winding path that had brought her to this moment. She thought of the shattered glass at her engagement party, the whispered cruelty of guests who had treated her heartbreak as entertainment, the long months of rebuilding her confidence, and her career entirely through her own determination. She thought of Julian's continued professional decline, his reputation having never fully recovered from the public humiliation of that gala evening, and of Camille's quiet departure to a different city, seeking a fresh start she could only hope brought her some measure of peace. But mostly, standing beneath the roses with Nathaniel's hand steady in hers, Elena thought of how far she had traveled from the woman who had once believed her worth depended entirely on being chosen by someone else, who had shrunk herself to fit into a relationship that ultimately proved unworthy of her genuine strength and ambition. She understood now, with a clarity that had taken an entire year of heartbreak and healing to develop, that her value had never depended on Julian's faithfulness, on Camille's loyalty, or even on Nathaniel's public declaration in a crowded ballroom. Her worth had always been her own, built through years of dedicated work, genuine kindness toward those she loved, and a resilience she had not fully recognized in herself, until circumstances forced her to discover it. As she and Nathaniel exchanged their final vows, sealing their marriage in front of family and friends who genuinely celebrated their union, Elena felt, for the first time since that terrible night at the Grandview Hotel, entirely whole. Not because a powerful man had chosen her, but because she had finally learned to recognize and honor her own worth, regardless of who stood beside her to witness it. The reception that followed carried none of the tension or scandal that had marked her previous engagement celebration, filled instead with genuine laughter, heartfelt toasts, and the quiet satisfaction of watching two people build a life together, on the solid foundation of mutual respect and hard-earned trust. Elena danced with her father, laughed with Priya over shared memories of the difficult months that had led to this moment, and found herself, throughout the evening, repeatedly catching Nathaniel's eye across the crowded room, each glance carrying the same steady warmth that had first drawn her to him, amid the wreckage of her shattered engagement. As the evening drew to a close, Elena stood with Nathaniel beneath the same string lights that had witnessed his proposal months earlier, watching their guests slowly depart into the cool autumn evening. "Any regrets?" Nathaniel asked softly, wrapping an arm around her shoulders, as they watched the last of the wedding lights flicker in the darkness. "Only one," Elena said, leaning into his embrace. "I regret not seeing Julian clearly sooner. But I suppose that heartbreak was necessary to bring me here, to this exact moment, with you." "Then perhaps," Nathaniel said gently, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "It was not entirely a tragedy after all, but simply the difficult beginning of a considerably better story." Elena smiled, resting her head against his shoulder, and allowed herself, finally, completely, to believe that the worst night of her life had indeed led her to the best one, and that whatever challenges the future might bring, she would face them, not as a woman waiting to be rescued, but as a partner, standing firmly on her own strength, beside a man who had never once asked her to be anything less than exactly who she was. 5 years passed, and the city that had once whispered so cruelly about Elena's broken engagement had long since moved on to newer scandals, newer stories, though the memory of that night at the Grandview Hotel still occasionally surfaced in conversation, usually framed now as the beginning of a remarkable love story rather than a tragedy. Larkspur Events had grown into one of the most respected planning companies in the region, with Elena and Priya now overseeing a team of over 20 employees, handling everything from intimate family celebrations to the same grand charity galas that had once launched Elena's relationship with Nathaniel into public view. Elena had never abandoned her career for the comfort of her marriage, a choice Nathaniel had supported unwaveringly from their very first conversations about the future they wanted to build together. Their home, a warm and welcoming house, considerably smaller and more modest than the grand estate Nathaniel had inherited, reflected the values they had built their marriage upon: comfort over ostentation, genuine warmth over empty grandeur. Nathaniel had gradually stepped back from some of his more formal social obligations, preferring instead to focus the foundation's efforts on programs that made tangible differences in struggling communities, work that Elena often helped coordinate through her own professional connections. They had welcomed a daughter into their family 2 years into their marriage, a bright-eyed girl named Sophia, who had inherited her mother's determined spirit and her father's quiet steadiness. Elena often watched her daughter play in the same gardens where Nathaniel had proposed, marveling at how completely her life had transformed since the night she had stood amid shattered glass, believing her future had crumbled beyond repair. Occasionally, news of Julian reached her through mutual acquaintances, though she found these updates carried less and less weight as the years passed. He had eventually left the city entirely, his professional reputation never fully recovering from the public humiliation of that gala evening, though Elena felt no particular satisfaction in his continued struggles, having long since released the anger that once accompanied any mention of his name. Camille, she had heard, had eventually married in her new city, building a quiet life far removed from the social circles that had once connected them, and Elena found herself genuinely hoping her former friend had found some measure of peace, even as she remained grateful for the distance that continued to separate them. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Elena and Nathaniel returned to the same garden where he had proposed, now accompanied by their young daughter, who ran delightedly among the roses that had bloomed even more fully in the years since. "Do you ever think about that night?" Nathaniel asked, watching Sophia chase a butterfly across the lawn while they sat together on a bench beneath the arbor. "The engagement party, I mean. The night we first spoke." Elena considered the question, feeling the familiar warmth of his hand finding hers as they watched their daughter play. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but not with the pain I once carried. I think of it now as the moment I learned my worth was never something someone else could take from me, no matter how badly they tried." "I've always admired that about you," Nathaniel said quietly. "The way you refused to let that night define you as broken, choosing instead to let it become the beginning of something entirely new." "I had help," Elena said, smiling as she watched Sophia stumble happily through the grass. "A patient, steady man who refused to let a room full of gossip decide my worth for me." "I only recognized what was already there," Nathaniel said, echoing the words he had spoken to her all those years ago by the windows of the Grandview Hotel. "You did the difficult work of rebuilding yourself. I simply had the privilege of standing beside you while you did it." They sat together in comfortable silence as the autumn evening settled around them, watching their daughter play in the gardens that had witnessed both the beginning of their courtship and the deepening of their commitment, and Elena found herself overwhelmed with gratitude for the winding, difficult path that had brought her to this exact moment. She thought of the countless women who might find themselves in similar circumstances, betrayed by someone they trusted completely, humiliated in front of people whose opinions once mattered far too much, and she hoped, in whatever quiet way such hopes could travel, that her story might offer them something valuable. Not simply the promise that a powerful savior might arrive to rescue them from their heartbreak, but the deeper truth that their own strength, patiently rebuilt through difficult months of grief and determination, would always be the foundation upon which any lasting happiness must eventually be built. As the sun began to set behind the garden's old trees, casting long golden shadows across the lawn where her daughter played, Elena leaned into her husband's shoulder, feeling the steady, comfortable warmth of a love built not on grand declarations alone, but on years of patient honesty, mutual respect, and the quiet daily choice to show up for each other, exactly as they were. The glass that had shattered on the night of her engagement party had long since been swept away, forgotten by all but the woman who had once stood amid its broken pieces, uncertain whether her life could ever be rebuilt from such devastating wreckage. But Elena understood now, with the clarity that only years of genuine healing could provide, that sometimes the most beautiful stories begin precisely in the moments we believe everything has been lost, waiting only for the strength within us to recognize that we were never as broken as the world around us believed, and that the truest love, when it finally arrived, would never ask us to be anything less than exactly who we had always been.